Hey kids, we're going to learn about the nervous system using the mannequins.
Okay, everybody, today we are going to make the brain with our mannequin clay. So you need to gather some things first. You're going to need the torso of the mannequin. You do not need to assemble the legs or the arms. Resist the temptation. Just get the torso. You're going to want to get several pieces of clay, a fairly long piece of red clay, a piece of blue, yellow, and green that are maybe half the length of the red. You need a good old chunk, a good, I don't know, small tomato of this tan color. You need a wire tool, and then a dry paper towel is helpful to just kind of wipe your hands off and wipe the towel down. So the first thing you're going to make is the frontal lobe. So to do that, one brave member of your group can take the red clay, hold it up like that, put a hand underneath, and you're just going to crinkle it like that, kind of loosely, into a little ball, like that. Now the reason why we want to do it that way as opposed to just rolling it into a big, like a super ball kind of thing, is because we want to sort of represent the bumps and grooves on the surface of the brain. So I want you to pause the video and tell the person next to you, what are those bumps called and what are those grooves called that we're representing with this clay? I hope you said that the bumps are the gyri and the grooves are the sulci. If so, pat yourself on the back. Okay, so this represents the frontal lobe. And so we're going to take our mannequin and we're going to place it in the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe, of course, is in the front. So we're just going to shove it in the front. Now, notice a few things about this. Number one, it should be about level with the eye. That should be kind of the lower part of this. You can kind of push it up and squish it if you need to. And note that it's only taking up the most anterior half of the skull cavity. Okay? Next, we're going to make the temporal lobe. And for that, we're going to use green. Same technique, somebody different. Pass the clay, somebody new. Take the temporal lobe, the green, and same technique. Kind of lower it down, squish, squiggle, and you're going to make a little clump. This one is going to be a little bit more oblong in shape, though. And we are going to shove it back against the back of the mannequin. Turn to the person next to you and tell them what part or what is the main function of the temporal lobe. What information does it process? If you said it processes hearing, good job. Okay, so the temporal lobe is kind of pushed in the back, and you really can't even see it necessarily in this sagittal section that we're going to make. So next, I want you to pass the clay, and we're going to make the next lobe, the parietal lobe, with blue. Next person number 3, take the clay, scrunch it down, scrunch it up like that. And this is going to go in kind of the front half here of the of what remains. That is the parietal lobe. Turn to the people around you and tell them, what do you think the parietal lobe does? What's its function? And hopefully you told them that it processes sensory information such as touch. So then we're going to take the final piece of clay, final partner number 4. Same technique, lower it down, lower it down, lower it down. And you're going to make the last piece. And that is going to be the occipital lobe. Note that there's a roughly straight line here between the different lobes of the cerebrum. And note that the frontal lobe takes up the first half, and the parietal and occipital lobes take up most of the second half. So kind of pause the video and check to make sure that yours looks like mine. You can even see the temporal lobe peeking out there from below. And then tell the person next to you, what type of information does the occipital lobe process? And if you said it processes visual information, nice work. Okay, so now that the cerebrum is roughly done, I just want to highlight some features that a lot of kids forget about. I want to emphasize the cerebral cortex is that outer layer of cerebrum. So I'm going to use my wire tool to sort of highlight the fact that this outer layer of cerebrum is the cerebral cortex, and I'm going to isolate that a little bit. And this is probably not absolutely perfect from an anatomical point of view, but we're just trying to illustrate the concept here. I want to be careful not to mix the clay colors if I can, because we need to reuse the clay. But I've kind of isolated the cerebral cortex, and I can kind of use these hash marks to sort of emphasize that that outer layer here is the cerebral cortex. And I want you to tell the people in your group, is the cerebral cortex made of gray or white matter? And if you said gray matter, nice work. And then I want to highlight the motor area and the somatosensory area. The motor area is an output, so tell the people next to you, if it's an output, would you expect it to be on the frontal lobe or the parietal lobe? And if you said frontal lobe, good work. So there's a little strip right here, right next to right at the border between the frontal and parietal, and I'm just going to kind of mush that down and kind of emphasize that that is the motor area. So this little strip of cortex, it goes all the way along the edge of the brain here. There's little portions of that mapped out to each part of your body, and different parts of the brain control different types of movement. The somatosensory area is an input. So that's going to be on the parietal lobe. So once again, I'm just going to kind of mush a little section of parietal lobe in. And I recognize this does not look pretty, but we're just trying to remind ourselves of the anatomy here. And so just this little strip right here, again, it runs all the way along the surface of the brain like that. That strip is the somatosensory area. And again, different parts of the body are mapped to specific parts of that somatosensory area. I can also kind of highlight the fact that there is this corpus callosum. Tell the people next to you, what does the corpus callosum do? And if you said it allows the right and left halves of the brain to communicate, you are correct. And there's this kind of little strip that comes along like this over the edge here. And so the corpus callosum is sort of roughly in that area. Again, not a great representation of the anatomy. We're just trying to remind ourselves of the concept. Okay, so our mannequin has a fairly decent cerebrum at this point. Now we're going to add a cerebellum. So for that, I'm going to take this ball of clay, and I want to pull off maybe about a grape or a cherry tomato worth of clay. I'm just going to roll it into a ball like this between my hands. Looks nice. Whoops. And then I'm going to shove that in there. And you know, it looks a little big. No problem. It's clay. I'll just pull off a little bit. And it should kind of sit right underneath the occipital lobe. And the cerebellum looks like that. I want you to tell the people next to you, what does the cerebellum do? And if you said it helps with balance and coordination, you are correct. And if it helps with balance and coordination, it must be working in conjunction with the motor area of the frontal lobe. So you can start to see connections between these different parts. The cerebellum is kind of a pretty thing. It has some texture to it. So if you want to use your wire tool and kind of carve in a little bit of texture, you can, just to make it look a little pretty, like that. And so there's the cerebellum. And then there's one final structure of the brain that I want to build, and that is the brain stem. And the brain stem consists of the medulla oblongata, the midbrain, and the pons. And so for that, I'm going to take another little chunk of clay, and I'm just going to roll a little snake out of it. It doesn't really matter how long it is, because we're going to add the spinal cord in a moment. But I'm going to make it, fairly slender here. And if you look at a diagram, the pons part of the brainstem kind of bulges out. So to represent that, I'm just going to bend this over like that. And then make the rest of it a little bit skinnier. That's not working too well. And I'm going to place that brainstem here in front of the cerebellum like that. Now, you'll notice that the rest of this is continuous with the spinal cord. And so the brainstem eventually merges into and becomes what we call the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is in between your vertebrae. So if you look at the back of the mannequin, you can see, oh, this little extension here is part of the vertebrae. And so it's just going to run down those vertebrae. And it goes about to the base of the rib cage like that. And so now we have the spinal cord. So at this point, I want you to take a moment with your group. I want you to review what each lobe of the brain is, including that hidden green one back there. Review what this structure is. Review what this structure represents, what this structure represents, and what these three things we sort of attempted to carve out to remind ourselves about. Identify all of those structures and try and also include the functions. And if you can do that, you're in pretty good shape.